Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast all about freedom and the nanny state. In this episode, we discuss the monkeypox panic, the fall of the Tavistock Clinic, the rise of Britain's thought police, and of course, our new postbag section. Welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked. I'm joined today, as I am in every single episode, by the IEA's own Chris Snowdon. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm very well. Happy to be here yet again.
Very happy to have you. And we're especially happy to have Joanna Williams, who is our special guest today, Spike columnist, the founder of the Keo think tank, and the author of a very good Spiked book called How Woke Won. Joanna, thanks for coming on the show.
I'm very excited to be here for the very first time.
So we're going to talk about a lot of quite contentious topics this time around. Just kicking off with something that you've picked, Chris, which is monkeypox, which has just been, I say just, in the past month has been declared a global emergency by the World Health Organization. It's been generating a lot of kind of panic coverage for a while, this being a outbreak which is affecting people in Europe and America, a disease that seems to originate mainly out of Africa, but there's been these concerning outbreaks, predominantly amongst gay and bisexual men, and a lot of kind of panicked headlines in recent weeks, even though it doesn't seem like there's necessarily as much of a kind of panic response from the government, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
How worried should we be about this? And what do you make of the discussion and the coverage of this?
Well, it depends who you are, really, about how worried. Most people should definitely not be worried about it. Firstly, let's say it's a great name, isn't it? Monkeypox. It's a proper name for a disease. Instead of like SARS-CoV-2 and stuff like that, straight in monkeypox is tremendous.
Well, it's racist, according to some people. There was
I'm
big
surprised they
campaign to
haven't
get them to change the names. So.
Yeah.
As yet unsuccessful, but anyway.
So, yeah, unfortunately. The thing I want to say about monkeypox is I don't feel that people are being entirely straightforward about it, right? The facts are really very clear. Like, this is the UK Health Security Agency's latest data. Of the 2,710 cases in the UK, which is not really that many considering it's been around for a while, right? 99.1% are men, 73% in London. That's kind of incidental, but interesting. And 96.5% are GBMSM, which is a clumsy acronym for gay, bisexual, or men who have sex with men. Why can't call it men who have sex with men? Or indeed, gay and bisexual seems to cover
pretty decent
every option, really, isn't it? Anyhow, the point is 96.5%. There's other data showing that it's not just gay men. It's a specific subset of gay men, primarily who go to a lot of, have multiple sexual partners, right? Go to various orgies and so on. The outbreak seems to have started in 2 or 3 like big gay sex festivals in Germany and Barcelona and so on. It's the same in America. It's fairly obvious what's going on, right? And yet they refuse to say it's a sexually transmitted disease based on what I would consider to be a technicality, right? In Africa, it's not considered to be a sexually transmitted disease. You get very small outbreaks, and I don't know how it gets started, but yeah, very small outbreaks. It doesn't really spread like it has done in Europe, and it's not primarily caused by sexual intercourse, right? The technical definition of sexually transmitted disease is it's mostly transmitted through sexual intercourse. And traditionally, it hasn't been. I think, based on the statistics I've just given you, there's a very good case for saying that the European outbreak of monkeypox is a sexually transmitted disease, right? That is primarily being transmitted through sexual intercourse. So they won't say that. And that straight away to me is misleading, because most people, if you say monkeypox is not a sexually transmitted disease, people think, oh, okay, I can't catch it through sexual activity. And then they say but it's close contact, which obviously you need close contact for sexual activity in the first place. I mean, why don't they just be honest and say this is something that, yeah, in theory anybody could get it, although like only less than 1% of the people who have got it are women. For a start, with a bit of a giveaway. Why can't they just say, look, this is something that's happening with these particular communities, and maybe lay off the orgies for a few weeks, possibly, it's up to you. Not going to tell you what to do, but yeah, maybe think twice about going to a fetish party or whatever. But whenever the health authorities say that, and they more or less have, to be fair, like the UK Health Security Agency, this quote is, there is no robust evidence of sustained transmission outside some sexual networks of GBMSM. World Health Organization even says this is an outbreak that is concentrated among men who have sex with men, especially those with multiple sexual partners. But you say that on Twitter, and apparently that's incredibly stigmatizing. And we don't want to go back to the 80s with AIDS. And I just don't get it. It seems to me totally counterproductive to kind of lie by omission about this in a way that is probably encouraging people to do things that are going to get them this fairly nasty disease. It does sound quite painful, although it's not fatal. For reasons of, I think totally misguided political correctness. Because I don't think it would lead to stigmatization particularly anyway. And the kind of people who do stigmatize people who go out and have multiple partners, they're going to stigmatize them regardless. It's not feeding through to the rest of society to any real extent. So why would anyone go on some kind of anti-gay pogrom about it?
No, it does seem to me a bit like, I think it was Tim Black wrote this on Spike last week, that the fear of stigmatization is worse than the fear of the disease itself, or worse than the reality of the disease itself, I should say. There's an interesting article in the Telegraph just today, and it's pointing to the fact that in Spain, somebody in Spain, I don't know who, it doesn't name them, took a photograph of a random man sitting on a train who had marks on his skin. And this photo has gone viral, of kind of the accusation being this man has monkeypox and is spreading it around by sitting on a train. Turns out the man has nothing of the sort. He doesn't have monkeypox at all. He just had some, I don't know what, acne scars or something like that, some rash on his skin. But the very fact that this prompts a headline in a national newspaper, and somebody from the British Skin Foundation has come out and made a statement in response, taking unsolicited photos of people and making assumptions about their skin is inappropriate and unethical. And you just think, what an overblown response to one person taking and tweeting a photo. It was a stupid thing to do. I'm not suggesting people go around taking photos of random strangers who have skin conditions on public transport. But you just think all of this kind of warning us, don't go around doing that, as if that's what we're all kind of just dying to do the next time we go on a train. Seems so overblown in response to.
I've got an even better article, right? This is from New Scientist last week. The headline is "Monkeypox linked to penis swelling and rectal pain in ongoing outbreak." Penis swelling and rectal pain don't normally occur with monkeypox, but a study of around 200 men in London suggests the symptoms may be common in the latest outbreak. And the article basically just goes on to say scientists are baffled by this.
I don't think I am baffled.
9 of the participants also had swollen tonsils, another atypical monkeypox symptom. You don't need to. I don't claim to be a scientist, never have done, right? But you don't. I think I can work out what's going on here. And they quote some scientists going like, it's unclear why monkeypox is causing new symptoms. She says it may suggest a change in natural disease course, or it may be due to the mode of transmission. I'm going to go mode of transmission. This is just gaslighting, isn't it?
It's incredible. But as you were saying, Joe, it's just the fear of stigmatization being so far. Even to the point, as you were saying, that the people to really think about at this point are the acne sufferers who might be, misstigmatized by all this. It was interesting as well because the coverage seemed to go in kind of cycles, and it seems to constantly go through this, where at first it was people are making too much of this connection. Even the UN AIDS program said something to the effect of there does seem to be a kind of connection, but this is being used to peddle stereotypes about gay men, etc. And then a few weeks roll on and suddenly it becomes really homophobic, the fact that we're not talking about the fact that this specifically affects gay men. Owen Jones has said something to this effect, because of the fact that we're allowing another disease that disproportionately affects gay men to effectively just pass us by without proper public health responses and messages and all the rest of it.
But what about the response to the other disease of our times, COVID-19, right? The contrast could not be any greater between COVID-19, which I grant you is a more serious disease. Obviously, it kills far more people. But with COVID-19, wear a face mask, don't leave your house, rope up the blooming playground swings and all this stuff. And with this thing, where people just giving fairly sensible, modest advice, which is only advice, no one's forcing you not to go to an orgy. But if you just say, maybe don't go to any gay orgies for a couple of weeks, see what happens. So, no, you can't do that. In San Francisco, the authorities there, do you see this? They were giving people advice on what to do if you're going to a gay orgy and you've got monkeypox. And it just said, try and cover up your sores and stuff like this.
I have to say, one thing I do find reassuring, though, is it did seem that as if there was a point, perhaps about 6 weeks ago now, or when this story of monkeypox really first broke, when there seemed to be a determined effort to try and make it into a thing for the general public. And you did have these quite alarmist headlines in The Guardian, on the BBC in particular. And then you've obviously got the World Health Organization coming out declaring this a global emergency. And I guess the thing I found quite reassuring was just the fact that certainly every single person I know reacted to this with a tut and an eye roll. You know, it's like, no, we're not going to go into panicking about this. And people would just seem to be quite measured and beyond all the panic mongering, looked at it and said, yeah, the chances of me catching that are pretty much zero. I'm not going to give up time and energy and emotion on panicking about it.
Exactly, because you don't need to read between the lines very much to see that unless you're in a very small subset of a subset, you've got an extremely low chance of catching it. Dr. Tedros from the WHO, in his initial response to this, said the stigma is worse than disease. Stigma is worse than the virus, which is word for word what he said back in like February 2020 about COVID-19, when he was terrified there was going to be some massive racist attack on Chinese people around the world, which never happened.
No, exactly. I mean, it does seem like the two worst things for public health, at least in terms of this. It's not stigma, it's either panic or political correctness, which seems to be the two things very much. I mean, it was, during going back to the COVID pandemic, that point in which you had all of those public health doctors sign an open letter, having previously condemned kind of right-wing demonstrations, saying that Black Lives Matter effectively got a free pass because the real virus is racism.
I wrote a very good article for Spikes about it.
Excellent, it was. It just shows it infects, identity politics infects absolutely everything, which is a lesson, Joe, that we've been learning in the UK for a very long time. And I want to now move on, if we're done with monkeypox, to talk about some pretty significant blows to the whole gender identity ideology in the UK and over the course of the past 6 weeks, really. I mean, Maya Forstater winning her discrimination case at the beginning of July. You then had Alison Bailey, the barrister, win her discrimination case. These are both kind of gender-critical women put through the ringer by their employers or barristers' chambers in Bailey's case. Them, again, winning those cases. And then, in some respects, probably most significantly, is the fall of the Tavistock. So last week it being announced that the Tavistock Clinic, which essentially is the one gender identity service clinic for trans kids in the UK. Many people have gone through it, and many people have been really terribly affected by their affirmative approach. That's being shut down. Do you want to just talk to us a little bit about those moments, really? Where do you think we're at? Is the tide turning, to reach for that cliche at this point?
Yeah, I hope it is. I mean, it certainly seems a lot more positive a landscape than we were at, even a few months ago now. And I think the other thing you could add into the list of things that you've noted there, Tom, is some of the discussions that have come out off the back of a Tory leadership campaign. I mean, the fact that Penny Mordaunt, who'd previously, although she tried very strenuously to deny it in her election bid to be the next leader of a Tory party, she had largely been responsible for trying to push through the changes to the Gender Recognition Act. And she had really been quite a spokesperson for trans lobbyists in Parliament. But the fact that she was taken to task for that, the fact that she felt the need to have to deny this, the fact that both Truss and Sunak have made, perhaps in Sunak's case, I suspect, a little bit half-hearted, or feels a little bit half-hearted, been very clear about what a woman is and felt the need to have to actually say that, I think does show that the tide really is beginning to turn a little bit. Personally, I do think there is still further to go. I mean, the thing with the Tavistock collapsing, I think that's a huge victory. I mean, it's really remarkable and definitely something worth celebrating, and something which, like I say, a year ago would be unimaginable. But I think the thing that strikes me is that the Tavistock wasn't going out actually recruiting patients. It was dealing with people who'd been referred to it. And the big problem is that, there'd been a 20-fold increase over the course of 5 years in the number of people, children, who'd been referred to the Tavistock. So I think it's great that the Tavistock's gone, but I think we also need to start thinking much more carefully about where were all these children coming from? What was it that was pushing all these children to start questioning their gender identity and to seek out the services of a clinic like the Tavistock? And for that, I think we really do have to be looking at much more closely at what's going on in our schools, what's going on children's television, on the media, with the media that children are consuming, social media, and really the extent to which these ideas have become embedded within the kind of daily culture that young people are living through. So, I mean, it's brilliant that the Tavistock's gone, but I think what we need to do now is really turn the tide on what was pushing children towards seeking out the services of the Tavistock in the first place.
And Chris, what have you made of recent developments on this front? Do you think kind of sanity and common sense are breaking out here, or is it too early to say?
feels to me that the high watermark has been reached. I think the thing that represented the start of sanity returning was when was it the International Olympic Committee that said men
swimming.
can't compete in swimming? Yeah,
I forget the acronym.
There's been one or two, I think, haven't there? Major like sporting organisations have said, look, if you're born a man, you can't compete in women's sport, and that to me, and not just that decision, but the lack of a backlash. Apart from a handful of the usual cranks, most people, when I say most people, the vast majority of people went like, well, yeah, obviously. Right. And I think the rest of the sporting world will go the same way. The closure of the Tavistock Clinic is obviously very good news. Joanna's obviously right that Penny Morden's involvement in this whole thing really worked against. I know it's in the Tory leadership contest, but I didn't see a load of people from Labour like suddenly taking a side. Yeah. I think Keir Starmer and Labour Party will eventually drop it themselves. Because you can't, in democracy, you can't carry on pushing something that like 98% of the voters don't agree with. So I'm fairly optimistic with you. And to be honest, once that's done, once you haven't got people born as men competing in women's sport and people born as men going to women's toilets and women's prisons, I'm not that bothered about the issue after that. Happy to leave it. That was the only part of it that really bothered me.
And also, you can't carry on with pushing something which is so obviously not just damaging, say, freedom of speech and our ability to talk about these issues, but having a really disastrous impact on, say, children. I mean, the Tavistock thing, as you've written a lot about, Joanna, is fascinating in a horrendous fashion insofar as, this Cass report, Dr. Hilary Cass, who's been looking into this, posted an interim report in February and then sent this letter last week, which sparked the NHS to say we're going to shut this down. It's pointing to the fact that, again, they're pushing this affirmative approach, that staff are actually being intimidated into affirming a child saying that I believe that I'm the opposite sex and not challenge that whatsoever. Put them on puberty blockers, which have been established to be essentially a kind of experimental treatment, and that being a kind of ramp towards putting them on cross-sex hormones, which could be more damaging, and essentially the silencing of dissent from within as well. There's been cases of people raising the alarm about this for 18 years, I think. So Susan Evans, this mental health nurse who was talking about, was particularly struck when there was one particular case of a 16-year-old boy who was being put on cross-sex hormones after a handful of consultations. And I feel like this, particularly hand in hand with something like the grooming gang scandal, is just, we talk about political correctness as if it's something which is nice and kind and cuddly, and it's about trying to be open and inclusive to people. And it's about the most vulnerable. And yet, time and time again, it seems to have the most callous, dangerous impact on the most vulnerable people in society. But, one thing we talk a lot about, Joanna, is how entrenched these ideas are. You push back in one area, it roars back in another. You think you've tackled it in a particular institution and, these kinds of stories continue to proliferate. Are you confident that there's enough momentum behind this now to kind of push it in the right direction?
Well, I really hope so. I do worry about, I talked earlier about schools. I also worry about the civil service, and I worry about the civil service particularly at this moment in time. We know that Kemi Badenoch came out at the weekend and she talked about the problems that she had dealing with the civil service, who were basically trying to thwart her when she was asking to meet with people like Keira Bell and meet with people who were critical of the Tavistock, how she was actually stopped from being able to do that. But I think at this moment in time, with Boris Johnson gone and essentially a vacuum now, where we should have a government and people who should be heading up the Department for Education, people who should be heading up the government full stop, are not there. I have to say people who were elected on a huge mandate to implement change have been booted out or resigned from their positions. And so my worry is that at this point in time, the civil service pretty much have free rein. One policy example of this, for example, in the Department for Education, there is supposed to be legislation being passed to make sure that every school has the same policy in relation to transgender pupils, one that would commit schools to having to inform parents if a child asks to change their name or change their pronouns whilst they're at school. Now, because there's no body really in charge of a Department for Education at the moment, that's now been dropped. That won't be in place in September. So the knock-on effect is every school now has their own individual policy, most of them just absolutely cut and paste from advice that's been given from Mermaids, Gendered Intelligence, Stonewall, and that means don't tell the parents. You don't have to tell parents if a child wants to socially transition. So, I think clearly the tide's turning, a long way to go. Yeah, we can't be complacent. I think for me, that's the key message. We should celebrate. I think there's some real victories to celebrate, but that can't equate to complacency.
Mm-hmm. And Joanna, just because this is a sort of libertarian podcast, this is one argument that you kind of come up against when you're talking about the general trans issue. Not often, because most of the people who are pushing this don't really care about freedom very much, but the kind of handful of libertarians who are up to their neck in gender ideology, there are a few of them, sort of tend to be younger, will say that things like gender self-ID, isn't this just an issue of people being able to be free to make their own decisions? They don't have to bother going through the bureaucracy of having to deal with doctors. Aren't the people who are kicking up a fuss about this just being kind of authoritarian in some sort? What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I think it's a stupid argument. And I think it's stupid because it totally ignores the reality of competing rights. So I have absolutely no problem. If you want to sit here and address Tom, you go for it.
I am instantly. No one can see.
Feel free. If Chris wants me to call him she, I'm very, I won't, but you have the permission to, you have the freedom to ask. But what, so I have no problem. People can dress what they like, call themselves any name they want to. But my problem comes in when that starts coming up against or coming into conflict with my rights, my right to access a single sex space, my right not to call you she if I so choose to do so. And, this kind of libertarian argument, well, we should just allow self-identification because that's so kind of cool and libertarian. I think, like I said, just totally ignores the rights of women to be able to say, no, we want single sex spaces and we want to, that the premise of that is the capacity to define what actually is a woman.
Mm-hmm. Not many libertarians, I think it's fair to say, but there's a few of them. Let's talk about the thought police, Britain's literal thought police. This has been a story that's been rumbling on for a very long time now. People in the UK, but also across the world, I think, have been sort of looking on aghast, really, as the police in this country have become more and more involved in basically policing speech, particularly online speech, getting involved in Twitter spats, the whole phenomenon of non-crime hate incidents, this kind of very Orwellian category of non-crime being recorded against people's names just because someone made a complaint. And in amongst all of this, we've had another big viral case of that in the past week. So there's a 51-year-old army veteran called Darren Brady, who had essentially reposted a meme originally popularised in recent weeks by Lawrence Fox, which is essentially the Progress Pride flag, which I'm not going to explain, but if you know
very
it.
Difficult to explain it.
Exactly. It's basically like the normal Pride flag, but with a weird chevron on it to one side, arranged into the format of a sort of swastika.
And loads more colours.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the
It's like medieval heraldry.
It's the rainbow gay rights flag with the Black Trans Lives Matter additions stuck onto it, and arranged in such a way this means to make it look like a swastika. I'm crudely trying to make the point about the authoritarianism of this particular movement. This gentleman shared it. He was visited by the police. They told him, allegedly, that if he paid a small fee, he could be put on a kind of training course.
Did he?
Which would re-educate him.
They asked for expensive.
It was. I've heard £60. I've heard £80 quoted, but they said they said that you have committed a crime. If you pay us this, you'll be able to go on this course. That will then downgrade it to a non-crime. So that was the offer made. What if
he didn't go on with that?
Well, this is what happened. So he ended up being arrested. So he'd already made contact with Harry Miller, who's one of the leading campaigners against these non-crime hate incidents, who has previously been visited by the police himself over things he's posted online. They'd already been in contact. So when the police show up 10 days later, as they said that they would, Harry Miller, along with Lawrence Fox, are there. They film the encounter. And the whole thing goes viral. Harry Miller, incidentally, actually ends up being arrested himself for trying to basically intervene in the arrests. We see, and this has gone around the world. It's been discussed a lot in America, who are looking at us and really confused as to what's going on in so many ways. And it's a really striking example, I think, not least because you watch that video and it's quite clear that these police officers don't really know what law it is that they're citing, what process it is that they're following. It's purely that this person has said something offensive. It causes anxiety in their words, and therefore they need to intervene. Chris, what do we do about all this? Where to start?
Well, we need a First Amendment, obviously, is the ultimate answer. I don't understand what punishment could they dish out to somebody who's committed a non-crime. That's what I don't get. So that normally, if you get a speeding fine, you can get off the speeding fine by going on an awareness course. But with this, you haven't committed a fine, but you can pay to go on an awareness course. I don't see what's in it for the for the perpetrator of this non-crime.
But I think that parallel with the speeding fine and the kind of the training course is a really important parallel to draw out, because clearly when it comes to speeding, there is a case for training to make people aware of the highway code, perhaps if they've forgotten it from the days and when they pass a driving test, and to point out to people that if you drive 40 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone, it's going to be more difficult for you to stop if a pedestrian runs out in front of you. So you can kind of see the point of that. But this way that the word education is being used by the police here, it is not education at all, because to me, education is about thinking critically. It's about knowledge and being able to think critically in relation to knowledge. Whereas clearly, this is such a Maoist kind of
re-education.
Yeah, it is re-education for you to correct your wrong thinking. You have expressed politically wrong thoughts, and we are going to take you away at your own expense and re-educate you, and we're going to carry on re-educating you until your thoughts are in line with the kind of approved thoughts. It's terrifying.
It is terrifying, obviously. It's completely unacceptable, but I don't understand the legality of it.
I don't think the police do either. I think
are they just making it up as they go along?
No. I think you're absolutely right, Tom. I don't think there is a legal basis for this whatsoever.
So Harry Miller got arrested?
Well, I think he might have physically.
But he didn't face any charges,
Yeah, well, I think the facts of this are that essentially that they allege that this gentleman had actually committed a crime, but they would, for some reason, downgrade it to a non-crime, which I have no idea how that makes any sense.
Been acquitted, I think, is what they call it.
Well, via this course. And then Harry Miller ends up being arrested because he tries to basically get in the way of the arrest. So so
that may have been a crime.
Yes, right. So he spends the night himself. But that's the fact.
I think what's really interesting, though, and it kind of draws parallels with what we were talking about in relation to the trans discussion, is that both government ministers and I can't remember the correct name for it, but the heads of the police service, or regional police and crime commissioners for one thing, but also the heads of the chief inspectors of constabularies have come out and said that they do not approve of this, that they don't think that this is a good use of police time. They'd rather the police were rounding up proper criminals who've committed rape, murder, or burglary.
Well, tell them to do it. If only they have the authority to do something about what the police can do.
This is the problem, and this is the big question. Why is this not happening? Why are the police? It's almost as if individual officers clearly have kind of either gone off script and decided for themselves that this is an important thing to. Well, it's like they would see themselves as the opposite of bad apples. I think they would see themselves as the good apples. Lots of people are pointing the finger at the College of Policing for kind of training police officers up in the first place to think that this is their role. But it just shows how, even if you do have changes at the very top of these institutions, it takes a long time for this cultural change to trickle down. I mean, some of these, whether it's teaching or the police force, have kind of been captured to such an extent by this kind of woke ideological outlook that it's really going to take a lot of effort to shift it.
No, I think that's a really important point. I think part of the reason that this keeps happening is because of the fact that it's not just one phenomenon we're talking about. It's not just the non-crime hate incidents, it's also people actually being arrested and put on trial under things like the Communications Act for grossly offensive speech. You have all this kind of array of different things. I think the common denominator is the police, and there's obviously a culture, not just within the police, but obviously the British state more generally, which is given to trying to police offence, seeing that as a proper thing. You often hear them quote, this is our obligations under the Equality Act to do this kind of thing. For the police in particular, they claim that non-crime hate incidents basically originate from the Macpherson report and Stephen Lawrence. And even though that's been contested, you can tell that this is their attempt to try and make up for that perception that they're effectively institutionally racist, they're institutionally bigoted, and therefore the push in the other direction to seem to be on the side of minorities has led them down this particular path. And it feels like if you don't challenge that culture, you're not really going to get anywhere. And you see that with non-crime hate incidents. There have been this very high-profile legal challenge via Harry Miller against this. He originally got the High Court to say that the police's intervention with him was unlawful, and then at the Court of Appeal they said actually the whole practice is unlawful, but it's lived on in a kind of discretionary form. And you feel like until there's actually a kind of root and branch change, we do just live in a time where the authorities seem to think that it's good and right and holy to get involved in things like
Definitely. One thing that worries me a little bit is we were saying earlier about the kind of positive things of Tory leadership candidates and how it's pushed this discussion of what is a woman, and they've all had to come out and actually say that there is such a thing as a woman. I do worry a little bit about both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, kind of slightly authoritarian tendency, certainly from Rishi Sunak today on his clampdown on the extremists who hate Britain. I mean, we've all cursed Britain at one point, haven't we?
I'm very worried about it.
Yeah, I just really hope that Nadine Dorries's proposed internet safety bill is well and truly put to bed with whoever comes to
definitely.
power.
Yeah, absolutely. Get rid of that. Bring in a right to free speech and abolish the Equalities Act.
I think that's a good place to end that particular segment. We should finish, though, on our postbag section, complete with its own jingle.
Postbag, postbag, postbag.
It's bulging, one take. Did that in one
Chris
take.
made the jingle. It was very good.
First-star singer-songwriter.
So let's reach into the postbag and look at what people have sent in. Actually, before we do that, Chris, I want to ask you a question myself, if I might.
Please go ahead.
There was this study doing the rounds which claimed, I think, that Sadiq Khan's TfL junk food advertising ban had been a roaring success. It stopped like 100,000 people getting really fat. It saved the NHS incredible amounts of money.
Yep.
Now, obviously, this contradicts everything you've ever said. So were you completely wrong? Should you resign? Should you give up? Or is this...
No,
it's the
mayor who is wrong. Very wrong
Tell me
indeed.
more.
It's not his fault in a way. He was just repeating the findings of a piece of junk science that was put out by advocates of the ban in the first place. The junk science took two parts. In February, there was a study saying that London households were consuming 1,000 fewer calories as a result of the ban. And then the second study that came out very recently essentially just did some economic modelling and some health modelling and said, well, what would happen if Londoners did reduce their calorie consumption by 1,000 calories? And the result was like 95,000 fewer cases of obesity already and savings of £208 million over a lifetime. That's the bit that Sadiq Khan didn't quite mention.
Yeah.
Now, I've never actually seen any study show how much health and social care savings you get over a lifetime. Sometimes if they want to really inflate the figures, they'll say 10 or 20 years. A lifetime, I don't even know what that means in a way. But anyway, it was all rubbish because the initial finding or claim that was based entirely on modelling really was complete nonsense. To put it as simply as I can, they looked at how much chocolate and desserts and what have you were being consumed in London before and after the ban. And they compared the amount that was consumed after the ban to a counterfactual that they made up in their heads that bore no plausible relationship to anything that could have conceivably happened. In other words, what they said was, had there not been a ban, the amount of so-called junk food that would have been consumed would have, for some reason, just rocketed up. and because it didn't rocket up, because it basically stayed about the same, or in many cases actually rose after the ban, then the difference between our counterfactual and what actually happened is 1,000 calories and 95,000. It's junk science. We shouldn't have to pay for this. Absolute rubbish. Obviously, activist-orientated quackery. There's no evidence whatsoever that ban has made any difference whatsoever. The only figures we've got on obesity actually in London are for so-called childhood obesity, and childhood obesity went up more than any other part of the country. In fact, went up twice the rate of the rest of England in 2020, where child obesity went up everywhere. Nothing to do with advertising, all to do with lockdowns. So the message really is get some exercise.
There we go. Practical advice in this show, as much as this is another question that pertains to the nanny state, but I think it's one any of us could really answer. To pontificate and work out where things might be going next. So John Bryan, Spike contributor, friend of the show, has asked us on Twitter, following on from advertising bans on fast food and gambling, what do you think will be the next target for a possible advertising ban? Joe, what sort of vice or pastime do you think is going to be in the crosshairs next?
I mean, you're right. It could be absolutely anything, couldn't it? I mean, there are so many different things out there that we're being told to panic about. We seem to be thriving off panic all the time. I do think that social media, and particularly social media for children, is becoming more of a panic, which is not to say I think that's completely groundless. Clearly, there are things that parents should be concerned about. But I do wonder about, I mean, we kind of laughed when China implemented this kind of lockdown on social media use for children, or I think it was even internet use for children more broadly. I don't remember. Somebody sits in the presidential palace and flicks the switch on the Wi-Fi after 8 o'clock every evening and kind of limits them to 2 hours a day. But I do wonder whether that might be a bit of a panic that we are told, parents in this country, if you're a good parent, you take your kid's phone off them after they've used it for a couple of hours each day. But anything that gets advertised could fall prey to a ban in just the same way. I mean, isn't everything bad for us? Just apart from kind of raw veg and nuts, you could see an argument for banning everything.
I would say there's a few possibilities. Crypto. A lot of people don't like the crypto adverts on the tube. I'm not sure how many there are of them. Many more since the entire market collapsed.
Yeah. I was going to say, God bless them, still goes.
But also vaping. I mean, the EU banned most vaping advertising, but it's still domestically legal, but Scotland's looking at banning it completely. And alcohol, which again, the freedom lovers of Scotland are looking at banning.
So we haven't got much time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question, Chris, which is aimed predominantly at you, which we didn't get to last time. And I want to read it in full because it's beautifully written. So, dear Mr. Snowdon and Slater, big fan of the podcast. I felt compelled to write regarding the dismissive comments that Chris Snowdon made about the Italian film Sarlo. Whilst I certainly can't object to the film not being someone's cup of tea, in many ways it should be regarded as a libertarian film and a critique of authoritarian state power like Animal Farm or 1984. The director was Italian and had lived through fascist Italy. Sarlo was the town that Mussolini established a rump state after the Allies captured Rome. He said that he made the film as a commentary on the dangers of power. It's a definite slippery slope from banning buy one, get one frees to torturing prostitutes in a castle. Incidentally, the meal served at the banquet was made of crushed biscuits and other sweets and apparently tasted quite delicious. Best regards, Andrew McBrain. Do you remember making these comments about Sarlo?
It was a couple of episodes ago, wasn't it? I don't really remember what
do you
I
have to say for yourself?
In my defence, I would say, firstly, Andrew, thank you for your comments. Didn't mean to offend you. It's good to hear from a sadist. So you're talking about, I didn't notice the subtext there. As Garth Marenghi said, I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards. And secondly, I would say I've read the original book. And to be honest with you, I found the film a little bit tame, a little bit vanilla, pulled its punches a bit too much. So as with most films, the book is always better.
Well, on that wonderful note, Joe, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's going to be very awkward if I get monkeypox.
I was going to say.
Next episode.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.